We're especially pleased to have Andrew Klumpp as our presenter tonight. Andrew is a native of Sanborn, Iowa. He serves as the editor of Annals of Iowa, the State Historical Society of Iowa's quarterly scholarly journal. He manages the Society's education, publications, and administration teams, and serves as the director of Iowa's Provisional Humanities Council. He earned his bachelor's degree at Northwestern College. Good for us. That's a proud moment for all of us, thank you. And he continued his education with a master's at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina, and his PhD at Southern Methodist. I have lots of pages. His research focuses on the Dutch immigration in the 19th century and their broader global worldview. His recent work also focused on the importance of state and local history as methods for telling larger national and international histories. Andrew will present Double Dutch, Dutch Immigrants as both Settlers and Missionaries. Now please give Andrew a doubly warm Orange City Dutch welcome.
Well, thank you so much for having me here. It's great to be back. I work at the State Historical Society, as you mentioned, and I always tell my colleagues that if there's ever a reason that people need to have us in Northwest Iowa, send me. It's one of those, it's very biblical, right? Like, here I am, send me. Northwest Iowa, I'm your guy. And so it's always just so great to be back. As you mentioned, I am a Northwestern grad. I'm also from Sanborn, so I grew up just down the road. Shout out for Sanborn. A couple people from my hometown here today. And so it's just wonderful to be back with you all. And I want to thank you so much for the opportunity to be here and talk today. Some of this is from my dissertation research, and also just to know what to expect. I kind of talk with my hands. I'm a little bit less formal, so if you wanted me to read a paper to you, now's your cue. Maybe find the exit. This will be a little bit more of a conversation today, but wanted to share some of the things I found. And this research that I've done, the stories that I found that we'll tell tonight, are things that kind of I noticed as I was doing research and growing up in a community like Sanborn. Going to college in a place like Orange City really informed where the questions came from that were answered through the research we'll talk about tonight, which is about these Dutch settlers who were both settlers but also missionaries out into the world. And what's interesting is tonight, what you'll probably hear, you'll say like, oh, this sounds right? Like this sounds right. But what I found is that when I went to college, went to get my master's degree at Duke, when I went down to do my PhD at Southern Methodist, some of the things that seemed natural or made sense were surprising to my professors or my peers. For instance, I remember it was 2016, there was an election that year, if you might remember, and I remember a lot of people talking about rural spaces not thinking very globally, right? That was a narrative that we encountered, and people thought, oh, rural people aren't thinking very globally. And I remember sitting and thinking, well, that doesn't sound right? I remember going to church at First Reformed Church in Sanborn, Iowa, and we would have missionaries come from India or missionaries come from all over the world. I remember getting the little, the envelope where you could put your money and you'd hear the updates once a year, right? Maybe some of you are familiar with that kind of rhythm. And I thought, it's not that these spaces and the folks who are living in these places aren't thinking globally, it's that they aren't thinking with maybe the metric or the worldview that some people are looking for. So some of my professors are looking economically. Well, why aren't we thinking about economics or thinking politically? And it was the religious worldview that I found, right? And that was a thing that kind of opened the door to the questions and to the research that I was doing, which is looking at the ways that people are thinking quite globally, and often for religious communities that is globally informed by missions, right? And finding the ways that they're getting this information. And so tonight we'll talk about some examples of people who were settlers, people who came with, some cases from the Netherlands, some cases they were born here to immigrant parents, but then also went out and were missionaries. And this idea of being both an immigrant and then leaving your new home to go to a global mission field was completely natural. Those things were not seen as oppositional, right? That's another thing that I found in working with immigration historians, right? And this is something that you found a lot with the fields that I worked with in history, right? Where you had, at first, immigrant historians focused on the experience of the immigrants in the United States, and that was a story they wanted to tell. And then immigrant historians have started to tell the story to say, well, it matters where they came from. It's not just about the fact that these communities were here, but also where they came from. For Dutch history, someone like Bob Swearinga, who's still working, still active. He's 90, how old is he, Doug? 90, 91, 92? He's in his 90s, working up in Holland, Michigan. He wrote a new book, yeah. He always is writing a new book. So the question with Bob is which new book. He's got a 3-volume history of Holland, Michigan. So maybe you can lure him here. 3-volume, like 1,200 pages of the history of Holland, Michigan. Everybody who ever lived there is mentioned. Not quite, but it's very exhaustive. But Bob, in his work, did a great job of tracing the fact that, oh, these people are from Friesland and they settled here, or these people are from this part of the Netherlands and they settled here, and it helped to understand the dynamics and the churches and where things went. And now I find, especially when we're talking about Dutch immigration history, we've done some of that work, and the question now is that now that we've landed and we've built these communities, where did they go from there? There's a great history, of course, of Dutch communities finding themselves in Holland, Michigan, and Pella, and then coming here to Orange City, everyone's favorite colony, right? I think we can say that, right? Don't tell. The new administrator of the Historical Society used to be the head of Pella Historical. So cut this part out of the video, right? Like Pella's great. Orange City, close to our hearts. And there's a lot of that. But today, so this is kind of pushing and telling a broader narrative, right? That it mattered that the immigrants came to the United States and they had their experience. It mattered where they came from in the Netherlands. And we still hear that today, right? How many of you have heard a joke about a Fries person, right? Like, of course we have, right? Maybe not everyone, but I've heard my fair share of Fries jokes, right? And then you go on to tell the story of where they've gone. So that's where this comes from in a lot of ways. And so this is a great picture I want to highlight, and you'll see it again later. This is from, it was a journal, but not really a journal. It was a student newspaper of sorts in Holland, Michigan. And this great picture of this. It's hand-drawn of an editor writing about Hope College, which is here. They've got Hope College spelled wrong, but then it's got all these interesting understandings of the world. Africa and Greenland, and then Lake Michigan's over here with the Suez Canal, and the Atlantic Ocean, and North America, and Alaska. It's all wrong, intentionally so, but it's a really interesting picture that in the 1870s, there's these kids at Hope College writing and thinking kind of critically and thoughtfully and satirically in this case about the world around them. So I want to tell you tonight a few stories about people who, am I got it right? Trying to move it forward. Turn it on. Yeah. They don't teach you that one at school, right? Oh, too far. So I want to tell a couple stories. We're going to go to China, and then we'll go to Japan, and then we'll end up here in Orange City and in the Middle East. But have any of you heard about the Oddies before? John and Frances Oddie. This is a couple. Great, that's great. These are people from Holland, Michigan. Frances Oddie is the daughter of Phelps, the founder or the first president of Hope College. She's the daughter. She's a really interesting figure. I could talk to you all night about her. She's the first woman to graduate from Hope College, and she let you know it. Right? She was very passionate about women's education. At her graduation ceremony, there's this great story of the fact that she and this other woman who had graduated, the first women to graduate from Hope, had to sit in the crowd while their male colleagues got to sit on the stage. But they let her give a speech, and she got up and let them know what she thought about it. And they have that in Hope. And she was polite, but also forceful. So she's this really interesting, fascinating woman, and then she marries a man named John Oddie. John is an immigrant from the Netherlands. He comes from the Netherlands. to Holland, goes to school at Hope College, learns all these things, and then becomes a doctor. But even though they're grounded in at Hope, grounded in Holland, their idea their whole time is to go on to be missionaries, right? So John Oddie is the first example I'll give tonight, and Francis goes along with him, of people who were immigrants. He came from the Netherlands in the 1860s to settle in the United States, and then as soon as he got here, he began to dream of a world where he left the United States and went on and preached the gospel. And in the case of John and Francis, they go to China. What is interesting about this moment, and we're living right now in the 1860s, 1870s, and we'll kind of end in the 1890s, is there's lots of immigrants and lots of people coming from the Netherlands who are very excited about the idea of global missions. And so everybody you'll meet tonight overlapped with one another at Hope College. Many of them came through places like Orange City or Pella, but they land at Hope College and then they go out into the world. And so when we talk about going from China to Japan and the Middle East, those aren't the only places people went to, but this is some of the story, right? That they're coming to the United States with the idea of going back, but they continue to nurse their relationships with the Netherlands in ways that I think are really interesting. So John and Francis are the first couple that I'll highlight for you tonight. And I want to highlight one thing about them, which is that they always pictured and understood their work in China as international and multinational. And why do I use that language, right? International, in the case that they are Americans, they're adopting an American identity. Frances is American. She was born in the United States. John is an immigrant who becomes American and then leaves, but they think of themselves as international, but they're also doing multinational work. They go to China, they stay in Fujian province. If you can think of China, this is them shortly after they've arrived. So Francis and John, two of their children, and then a young woman who worked for them, we believe. It isn't clear, but she would have either been a student at the school or someone who was kind of helping out in the household from China. But they lived in the far southern part of China. So if you can picture China on the map, if you've seen a picture of it recently with the Olympics, it's right on the ocean, the Fujian province. So this is where they land, and they're medical missionaries, and they're charged with going to build a hospital, right? And so they're living in Holland, Michigan. This is where they live. That's what they're doing. If I asked you, okay, you live in Holland, I need you to go raise some money to go build a hospital in China, where would you go? Where's your first move? Go to the church, right? So you go to your church. Well, they go to the church, but you know where they go to that church? The Netherlands. They say, you know what? Here we are. We're living in Holland, Michigan. Let's hop on a boat and head back to the Netherlands to raise some money for this hospital, and then we'll come back. So they do go to the church, but the first place they go is the mother church. They go home to the Netherlands, John's home, and it's really interesting. They build this hospital, and they have this story that the hospital was built on the donations of Dutch orphans. Who these Dutch orphans give 12 guilders, which is about $2.50. Today, these Dutch orphans put together these 12 guilders to send to them, and they carry that story with them. But it's interesting to me that you have these Americans, these immigrants who left, in John's case, left the Netherlands to come to the United States, and then chooses to go back to raise the money, to get the training, and then go. And he also gets a donation from Queen Wilhelmina eventually. So this is money that is coming from a variety of sources. And I want to highlight, this is something that Francis says. So I'll read a quote from you to help you understand that these missionaries are both settlers, but they also are missionaries, and they're living in this dual space, this double Dutch identity, that we are Dutch and we are American, and these things can live together, and we can be missionaries. Francis said when she was in China about the early 1900s, she said, quote, "The Dutch in America and the Dutch in Europe are meeting in Amoy," which was the English word for Fujian at the time, "and they're together helping forward the Master's kingdom," end quote. So in Francis's words and in her own understanding, this was a kind of a meeting of the Dutch, this broad category of Dutch that was both European and American meeting in Fujian. Right? So you have this really interesting dynamic. And what's interesting to me too is that they join a mission that isn't just Dutch the Netherlands missionaries, and Dutch from the United States missionaries, but also English Presbyterians, right? So it also have these other Calvinists who have joined together in this work, and they work together in doing medical missions and doing education. They are not terribly successful at evangelizing, which was often the case at the time. They're not having giant revivals, but they are really reaching the people in some other areas of need, mostly medical and educational, right? And that's very much a sense of what they did. And to highlight too, this is something, there's a great quotation here too, about how they understand their work in the Fujian province, right? The founder of the mission, who was a Presbyterian, whose name was Talmage, insisted that at its founding, the missionaries in China had dedicated them to, quote, to stated, intelligible, and informal exhibitions of divine truth on the Lord's Day and during the week. Be sure you understand, then preach, 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 all caps. I'm not going to yell, but you can imagine, right? Therefore, he swore that we have always made all other departments of mission work subservient to the proclamation of the gospel, right? But we hear that even today when we talk about medical missionaries. Maybe that sounds familiar to you, what you've heard in your churches or your schools, right? This idea that doing medical work or doing educational work is all in service to preaching the gospel. And that's what Francis and John were doing in Xiamen, in this area. Again, they weren't converting a ton of people, but they very much understood their work as contributing to the spread of the gospel, right? And so I highlight them, I've got lots of numbers, but I'm watching my time. I'm 20 minutes in, and we're just on John and Francis. I love John and Francis. They're a great example, though, right, of this idea of bridging both an identity as Americans and Dutch and missionaries, and that for these folks, they're writing back all the time, right? They're writing back just like you get in your churches, but in addition to that, they were writing to Volksvriend, they were writing to DAHM, they were writing to the Christian Intelligencer. So people are reading and finding out about what's going on. One thing I'll share, and then I promise last thing on the oddies, unless you ask me questions, and then I've got more to share. I mentioned that it's also about this idea of the global imagination of people who are living in these rural spaces. One of the things I found is that they weren't just, when Frances wrote back, she wasn't just saying, today I talked to a woman about the Lord. Like, she did do that, but she also talked about things like the Boxer Rebellion. So if you were a Dutch immigrant living in Orange City, reading de Volksvriend, right, in Dutch, you were also getting a play-by-play of someone who's living in China of what's going on with the Boxer Rebellion, what's happening there. You are getting this, and not just from a national newspaper, but from a woman who went to school with probably someone who went to school with your pastor, or at the time, actually, the principal of Northwestern Classical Academy, Zwemer, who we'll talk about later, right? She was a classmate of the Zwemers. They knew him, they knew her, and she was writing back, talking about this major international event, right? And she writes back that she's really hopeful that the Japanese will take her part of China and not the French, because she's really nervous about French Catholics. She's got a lot of anxiety there. It was interesting. I was talking to a woman from the Netherlands at a workshop once. I said, it's really curious to me that she would be more open to the Japanese taking her part of China rather than the French. And she looked at me and she goes, you must understand how long we've hated the Catholics. Her words, not mine. But her point was that, right, the Dutch have this long history of throwing off the Spanish Catholics, and so there was, in her mind, as a Dutch woman, it made total sense that there was nothing worse than Catholics taking over their Protestant section, right? And whether that's true or not, I haven't looked into it, but that was her understanding as a Dutch woman, that for 500 years now, and 400 at the time, there had been a lot of bad blood between Protestants in the Netherlands and Catholics, starting with the Spanish. And this is just shortly after, really, in the memory of maybe the parents of the Belgians having left the Netherlands, the United Provinces. So there's the oddies. Last thing, grab me later. Yeah, question.
What year is it?
This is she leaves on her mission in the 1890s, and she writes back about 1901. She comes home to the United States in 1902 for safety concerns with the Boxer Rebellion, and John actually dies in China about the year later, and she doesn't return to the mission field, though she stays active in the missionary community. So she's doing her work, she's getting her education in the 1870s, goes to China in the 1890s, and this is about the early 1901, 1902. So yeah, sorry, I get so excited I forgot the details of exactly the dates. Don't tell my historian friends. Thanks for asking. So I want to go on to the next group, which is another group of people that I encountered when I was doing research in Holland. And this is a group of Japanese students who attended Hope College. And so Hope College in the 1870s had about a dozen students from Japan attending. And so it's another really interesting moment in telling this story of the immigration and missionary story, because you have these immigrants. Hope was a rather young college at the time. This is the early 1870s, 1871, 72. And you have the first immigrant from Japan come over. And this is also a moment when Japan is not particularly open, right? Japan is kind of closing its doors, is trying to figure out what is it going to look like to engage with the West. It hasn't quite landed. It's coming off of its own internal struggles. And they're sending students to Hope College. The story goes that Phelps, the president of Hope, got a special dispensation from the Japanese consulate, and they said, yes, send them to Hope. Whether that's true or not, I've never found anything beyond his own story to tell that, but I can tell you that that's the story that he relays. And so we had these series of Japanese students who attended Hope College and got to know people like Francis Oddie and got to tell their story. They're going to meet another person named Albertus Peters, who is another missionary who eventually goes to Japan. And so for Japan, you have a really interesting connection to these Dutch colonies. It's not just that we've sent over missionaries to China, but these are people, your pastor again, probably knew someone from Japan when he was at college, because most of the students went over to Hope at some point, because Northwestern was a classical academy at the time, and they would have known and interacted with Japanese students. I found this really surprising. I didn't know about these folks. Maybe you know about the Japanese students at Hope, but these students were there. And then you get to about the 1890s again, as Francis is leaving with John to go to China. You have another missionary named Albertus Peters, who was a classmate of theirs, who goes to Japan. And what's really fascinating about this to me too, Peters, is a Dutch person, a settler living in the West, but then immediately wants to go out into the mission field as a part of this group of people, right? And what's fascinating is to watch the ways that Japanese people perceived their home country, right? A lot of the stories they tell, it's really surprising stuff, because you have actually their writings. You can find things that they had written themselves, not in their own hand. Someone with very good handwriting wrote what they wrote, but you have things that they had written in the archives at Hope, talking about how much they loved their homeland, how beautiful it was, in ways that are also evocative of the immigrant experience, remembering their moms, remembering their family, things like that. And so Peters goes to Japan thinking he's going to arrive at this place that's just ripe for the picking evangelistically, right? And he's disappointed. He really thinks that when he gets there, Japan is really ready for a full-scale conversion to Christianity, and he finds that that's not the case. But there's a real sense of affection there too, this international relationship. I highlight this too because one of the things I mentioned earlier, this kind of getting updates about the Boxer Rebellion in China, one of the things we see with these Japanese relationships is this sense of friendliness in Dutch communities, but also a sense of knowing the world around them, right? So one thing, this is something that Frances says, actually, who we just met, about Japan, to Albertus Peters. She writes, quote, "There will never be any talk even of war between the United States and Japan if the same spirit with which the Japanese students were welcomed to Hope College in the early years dominated all dealings of our country with the race that inhabits those beautiful islands across the Pacific," right? So this is Frances talking about her relationship with her friends who were Japanese students and what that will look like. Of course, we know that doesn't come to pass, but there is that sense of friendliness, and that is also probably why she looked more favorably on Japan to France as well, because she had those connections. But I want to highlight too that this is, again, a place where these rural spaces were very internationally minded. We're getting information, right? So as Albertus Peters was working in the mission field in Japan, the Sino-Japanese War took place. This is late 1800s, late 1890s. And he's writing back every quarter to a guy named Peter Karstedt. I don't have the name right in front of me, but he was the editor of DAHM. He would write a quarterly report in English, then it would get translated into Dutch and sent out to all the Dutch communities. But he was giving an update day by day of what was going on with this war between China and Japan, and he was always phrasing it and thinking about it in what it meant for his mission, right? And what was really interesting to me as I did this work is that Francis and John are living at the same time in southern China and not talking about this much at all, which tells us too how they're hearing from different missionaries and what the stakes are in Japan versus southern China. And so it was a really interesting moment to me to kind of begin to unpack this perception that these rural immigrant communities were just focused on building their own little Dutch enclaves and building up Northwestern College, which they were focused on, I say to the historian of Northwestern College, but they were focused on these things, but not just that. They were also hearing this news of what was going on and paying attention to the war between China and Japan, of course with their own interest, which is missionary focused, but it still mattered to these rural spaces, right? They didn't just come and settle, they also looked out into the rest of the world. And I think that's really surprising and exciting to think about how missionaries were both doing the work of spreading the gospel, but they were also doing the work of keeping their communities tied into a really robust and sometimes complicated political reality. And so I could talk about these folks for a lot longer too, as you might not be surprised to hear. But I highlight that to highlight the fact that you have these immigrants that are going at the same time. And then I want to make sure I spend a little bit of time with people who are a little bit closer to home for us, which is the Zweimers. So we have the Zweimers. I think the Zweimers are a great example, and I end with them because I think in a lot of ways they highlight for us the ways that Dutch folks were settlers and missionaries, and kind of the complete picture of the worldview that informed so many of the Dutch settlers who came, at least as far as it went in building Christian communities. One of the things I could talk about a lot longer too is this idea of building a Christian community. That was really at the heart of what these Dutch folks were doing. Even when they left the Netherlands in 1847, they were looking at building a certain type of Christian community in Holland, in Pella, and then here in Orange City and elsewhere, right? This was at the heart. Building a place where the church and the school were anchoring the communities, that you were building a certain type of commitment and covenant community. This was at the heart, and the Zweimers do a great job of helping us see that. There's a guy named Adrian Zweimer, and so he's not here. These are two of his sons, but Adrian Zweimer was the original, right? He's the first one. He comes over as an immigrant from the Netherlands along with 7 children and a wife, and he comes here to the United States, follows along, and wants to be a pastor. Now he has not gotten his MDiv. As someone with an MDiv, I know that's important, right? To have an MDiv to be a pastor. And in the RCA, that was a no-go. You needed to have an MDiv or a divinity degree to be a pastor. But he was one of the very few people that got an exception from the General Synod. So he had to go all the way to the General Synod of the Reformed Church in America to get permission to become an ordained minister, and he got it, 1, because they needed Dutch-speaking ministers, and 2, because they saw how many kids he had, and they decided that with 7 children and a wife, it was impractical to try to get a master's degree. So even then, they were aware of the work that goes into advanced education. But there was a sense then that Adrian goes on to become a pastor. He works in places like Sheboygan. He's in Wisconsin. He's all over these kind of colonies that are starting to spread throughout the region. And his children, I think, help us understand how the worldview that Adrian Zweimer brought with him from the Netherlands gets worked out as both a settler and a missionary, and how these things live together about building a really robust religious community. Now, on your left is probably, to most people, not here in Orange City, I say very clearly, the more famous of the Zwemer brothers, which is Samuel Zwemer. Are people familiar with Samuel Zwemer? No? Okay, a few. He was a very prominent, and I appreciate that about this crowd, because I've said are people familiar with James Zwemer. More people are going to be more familiar with James Zwemer, who worked here in Northwestern, than Samuel, and this is the only crowd in the world where that'll be the case, and I appreciate that, because Samuel Zwemer is one of the founding kind of leading figures in missionary work to the Middle East. He has a mixed record, right? A lot of people really think he did great things. A lot of people think he didn't do great things. In that his success record was low. His conversion rate. He wasn't a terribly successful missionary based on the reports we have, but he was excellent at boosting and promoting missions to the Middle East and to Muslim people. He was one of the first to work in that space. He is working in the Middle East for decades and decades, and then comes back to be a professor of missions at Princeton University. But he too, just like he was a classmate of Francis Oddie, of John Oddie, and of Albertus Peters, right? So there's this kind of cadre of missionaries that all go out together, and he is one of them, but so is he. He also, James, who we'll talk about later, is also in this milieu of all these folks. In the 1870s, coming up through Hope, and then eventually going out into the world. And so you have Samuel, who goes out into the world to be a missionary in the Middle East. He talks about, all of the challenges he faced, and I'm going to find a few quotations from him here. But he is incredibly influential. A historian of American religion, Thomas Kidd, who some of you may have read, writes about Samuel Zwemer that it is, quote, difficult to overstate Zwemer's importance in American missions to Muslims, or his role in popularizing the religion known as Islam to American Christians. He was certainly the most influential Christian missionary to Muslims of his time, if not ever. And Thomas Kidd knows his stuff, so happy to defer to him. But the point here, too, is that he comes out of this Dutch system. He doesn't come out of a vacuum. He is taught at Hope College. He's colleagues with people like Francis, John, and Albertus, and he goes out into the world to build a Christian community that is informed by the fact that his dad was a Dutch immigrant. And all of this makes sense to him. He talks about going out into camps with the Bedouins and how much he misses being able to be with other Christians. He talks a lot about missing Christian fellowship, but he does that in letters to his brothers here in Northwest Iowa, right? And he tells them over and over again, share my letters with everyone that you meet. Put these in the newspapers, tell people about them, circulate them. So he would write a letter, and the idea would be you get the letter from Sam or Samuel, and then you'd give it to somebody else so that they can share it, and you'd pass it around. It's kind of like a very slow version of email or a newsletter, right? That's kind of how it functioned. But he's also writing back about all the political dynamics taking place in the Middle East at the time, right? And so again, you have this picture of rural spaces being really globally informed, but through the lenses that make sense to them. So these Dutch communities are getting this information, but through the missionaries who are sharing it with them, right? And that goes back to my earlier point about people thinking, well, these folks weren't thinking internationally. And it's like, yes, they were, but through their own channels and in their own way. If I were I don't have to convince this crowd of that, because I feel like you would be on board, but that's very much, the argument of a lot of my work. But I want to highlight, too, his brothers. James, who you might be familiar with, was a principal of Northwestern Classical Academy, a very important figure in Dutch immigrant education. But they very much saw themselves as doing the same kind of community building, but in very different spaces, right? So you have Samuel, who's this giant international figure, but then you also have James, who's got a building named after him down the road, and was a huge influential person in Dutch Christian education, right? Building up this school to perpetuate this model of educating people to become pastors and missionaries and build Christian communities more generally. And that wasn't just through being pastors and missionaries, but by being educated. And he very much uses that language over and over in his writing about how he is doing his work to build up a church that isn't just based here in Orange City or Holland, but also has connections to his brother. And now the other brother I want to highlight is Frederick, and I couldn't find a good picture of him, but he's doing that other element. So if you have these three brothers, if you can picture them together, you have James, who's building up education and institutions in Dutch colonies here in the Midwest, places like Northwest Orange City and Holland. Then you have Samuel, who's out spreading the gospel throughout the world. And then you have Frederick, who's doing the third thing, which is hiving off and creating more spaces for more colonies for Dutch immigrants. And so Frederick is the brother who goes out into places like Yankton and founds a church and a community, and then goes farther out into South Dakota. So we're all familiar with that story of Dutch colonies hiving off slowly throughout the 1890s and further. And the Zweimers are touching all elements of this idea of being a globally minded settler, doing the missions, but also building the communities and then expanding the communities in their new homes. And they're all talking to each other all the time. Right? You know, they have all these letters going back and forth where they're constantly in communication. And to be clear, James does not think what he's doing is being an international missionary. Neither does Frederick think what he's doing as building up institutions. But they all see what they're doing as contributing to this broader worldview of building Christian communities that are both built by settlers who have come from the Netherlands to places like this, but also always expanding and going outward, always looking outward and constantly learning from and communicating with each other, often through letters, but also through their newspapers. And so that's the Zweimers story. I could talk about them more too, but you know how it goes. So I want to end with a really fun find that I made early in my research. That kind of captures what's going on in the stories that I've told, this idea of building institutions, of globally minded settlers who are at once a settler and at the same time missionaries, especially in this period from 1870s, 1890s, that early 1900s, with a story about a pageant, right? So I love a pageant. This is in 1937, the Women's Conference of the East and West Sioux Classes of the Reformed Church in America stage a Victory of Faith pageant in Alton. I think there's a copy in the Northwestern Archives. I think this is where I found it. And so it's just down the road. And in this, there's this great scene that's talking about the founding of Northwestern Junior College and then Northwestern Classical Academy. It was a dramatic affair, this whole pageant. There was Dutch colonial leader Jonas Michaelius showed up. There was a feisty spirit of the prairie that was embodied, so that was a thing. But the play itself was meant to inspire greater interest in missions. And it offered a highlight reel of the development of missionary consciousness among churches in this region, both rooted in Sioux County, at the heart of these settlements and then beyond. But as the play recounts, it tells stories, of course, of settlement building, church building, missionary outreach, but also, crucially, in this pageant, is the founding of Northwestern Classical Academy. And the drama made plain that the connection between the local and global was viewed with that particular religious lens, and is really captured in the story. So I want to tell you what that scene looked like, and then we'll have some time for chatting and questions. So the scene, it's set up 1882 in a tidy living room. I should note that the script says it is tidy, so it is Dutch. I'm sure someone was feverishly cleaning right beforehand and then apologized for how dirty it was. But in this picture, there's a young boy and a young girl, and they're talking to each other, and then they confess secretly that they both recently had a calling. The young boy recounts a sermon preached by the Domine, and he says, quote, he that showed how this great country of ours is reaching farther and farther west, how people from other countries keep coming to America as though to the promised land, but they do not find God here because there are not enough men who have dedicated their lives to the service of God, end quote. And then, convicted by the sermon, in that very moment, the young lad decides to become a minister. But alas, with no preparatory education to to help him enable him to enroll in hope, he queries, what can I do? Right, so this is telling the story of the founding of Northwestern, and so what can I do? You know, here he is in Little Orange City in this very tidy living room, and he's got a call, but there's no school here. And so then the girl confesses the same concern, but she's not headed to the pulpit, she's headed to the foreign mission field. Quote, I got to thinking of the children in foreign lands growing up, still ignorant of Christ, because there aren't enough consecrated persons to bring them the message. I, too, have decided to dedicate my life to Christ, and I, too, lack the preparatory training because there is no school here that I can go to. Again, subtlety. You know, they were really going for subtlety here. But after the pair declared their intention to serve the Lord for their entire lives and sealed their commitment with a hymn, of course. I'm surprised it's a hymn and not a psalm, but we'll see. It was 1937, not 1882, so maybe they forgot that we were really sticking to the Psalter then. But the girl announces there ought to be a school here with Christian teachers, that students may be educated to become Christian doctors, lawyers, teachers, ministers, missionaries, and to help fill the needs of the world today for men and women of that type. And so after they've discussed their dreams, of course, as symbolic representations of the spirits of sacrifice, progress, knowledge, service, ambition, worship, loyalty, and consecration, the curtain falls. So like all these different spirits show up and say, like, you got it right, kids. We need to figure this thing out. But after the curtain's fallen, onto the front stage, a narrator emerges and says, and it was such a spirit which prompted the organization of Northwestern Classical Academy. Wherever the settlement of Hollanders was to be found, there was also found a church and a school. The school played an important part in the program of mission in the Northwest. It has stimulated great interest in mission and made it possible for 120 men to go into ministry and about 40 more men and women to go as missionaries into the foreign and domestic field. Right, and then it wraps up. But this whole recounting of the story, right? I love this pageant. One, 'cause it's very dramatic, and there's all the spirits and all this and all the subtlety. But it captures the story, right, that we've been talking about tonight. That they say the founding of Northwestern captures at its heart the spirit that was at the center of these settlements, which is we are settlements building Christian communities, but not just for ourselves, but also to go out into the world. And so that is where they're double Dutch, right? They are both settlers and missionaries at once, and for them it makes total sense to put the two together. So we've got about 15 minutes for conversation. I'm going to wrap it up there, but I want to say thank you. I could talk a lot more, but I feel like we've landed that plane, and we can move on. So thank you, and we'll have time for questions. Any questions? Yeah.
So what do you think was the source of the origin of this missionary zeal? Was it national missionary societies like the Presbyterians?
Yeah.
Or was it from the state church back in the Netherlands?
Mm-hmm. So the question, I'll repeat the question, make sure everybody can hear, was what was the source for this missionary drive? And was it a state church? Was it something to do with national organizations like Presbyterians? I think it's a little bit of both. You know, so a lot of these immigrant communities do tap into the larger missionary organizations that are existing, especially within the RCA. The CRC is a slightly different story at this time because it's still getting stood up in a lot of ways because of the timing of where I'm at in the late 1800s, early 1900s. They do tap into those larger fields of missions, and you see a lot of interaction with often New York and New Jersey based RCA missionary organizations at that time. So you do have some of that, but I also think that it comes from, right, if you ask me where it really comes from, when you read the stories of these Dutch immigrants, they often came, especially the early ones, came because they were convicted very deeply about the importance of building covenant Christian communities that looked a certain way, that offered education in a certain way, that had a very pronounced worldview. If you ask Bob Swearinga, and I think he's right here, he'd say that those kind of seceders who came over first set the tone for the Dutch colonies that get settled here in the Midwest. And then people who come later, maybe who weren't even seceders, have to kind of adopt a similar lens. And so I think at its heart, it's a deeply held view of what it is to build Christian communities and education live out their calling as Christians. And it's an interesting dynamic too, because these are also Calvinists, right? And there's some, I didn't quote it tonight, but there's some language from these Calvinists who say, we believe that God is the only one who can convert someone, but our call is to go out into the world and try to, and send the message. Our job is to respond to God's call, and God will do the rest of the work. So they're not spending a lot of time fretting over how can I get the wording just right to convince that person to come to Christ. That's not on them. That's God's doing. But I think, yes, there's all these kind of coordination with these different groups, but at its heart, when you read their work, it seems to be a very sincerely held belief that this is just what it is to live out the faith that they understand as they understand it. That's a great question, though, right? How they do tap into those networks, though, to really maximize their impact. Oh, yeah, we'll go here and then to Dr. Holm.
So it's interesting that women could be missionaries
Yes.
and not pastors.
Right.
And last year in the Reformed Church in America, we celebrated 50 years of women in ordained offices and started talking a lot about this, how for years women were missionaries, but couldn't be ordained until much, much later. So I'm wondering if in your research you came across any sense of that irony at that time.
Yeah. Not quite, but a little bit. Someone, if you're interested in those, early periods, and I could talk about this a lot longer, is Frances Oddie, because she is sharp. She is smart, and she's very aware of the double standard that she faces. A good example, and she's really pushing hard in the 1890s and early 1900s, even for women to be treated as somewhat equal in the mission field. There's this great story I have of her. The Missionary Monthly is this RCA publication that comes out, and she writes this letter, I think pretty tongue-in-cheek, to the editor that, I noticed that there was nothing written by a woman in your most recent issue, and this was in the early 1900s. And she said, until you can find a woman correspondent, I will be writing you an article every single month to be published, right? Because her point was, there's all these women in the field, and you're not publishing them, so it seems like you're having trouble. So let me fill this void for you, right? And so there are people like Frances, and I never found anything from her arguing for ordained ministry, right? I think that was maybe a bit ahead of what she was thinking about, but she was very attuned to the disparities between men and women, and she was a very strong advocate for women's education, for women in the mission field, and she was also, a lot of the women I encounter are keenly aware that their path to ministry is to go overseas or to be an educator in some way, shape, or form, as that kind of came to be. But I didn't find a lot where they're really leaning into that, but I do find, especially Frances, if you want to dig into somebody who has a really sharp mind and a clear vision of the role of women in Dutch communities, Frances is just a dynamo. And really kind of shakes up your interpretation of things, right? She writes, the speech at her graduation is writing about the Witch of Agnesy, which is this really interesting story, but it's all about the importance of women's education. She just really rails against, and her dad's the president, right? Remember? Her dad's the president of the college, and she just goes in. So there's some really interesting stuff among some of these women, and a lot of them also, if they did ministry, now I got me talking and answering and remembering, a lot of these women would see ministry as being a pastor's wife. So the other woman who graduates with her marries a pastor, and that's her way of getting into ordained ministry. Frances goes to the field, her colleague goes to the parsonage, right? And that is how they understand what women could do. So. Kind of a long, rambling answer that says there's nothing definitive, but they were thinking along those lines, but not quite along those lines at the same time. So.
I was curious about the Japanese students who came to Poe.
Mm-hmm.
Did you read anything about their motivation? Were they sent by the government to explore Western education? Were they interested in missions themselves? Were they just interested in Western education, or to get away from home?
It's hard to tell exactly how they got there, right? Because you have the stories that are, they found the story with the first one was, his name was Ryozo Tagawa. The story is that essentially Phelps, the president of Hope, found him when he was out drumming up students and got him to come, and then a few of his colleagues decided that they would come as well. They all are at least claim to be converted to Christianity, you know, in their writings, right? So there is a sense of Christian identity that might draw them to a place like Hope, and they all do go home. For the most part, I think one or two might stay for a while in the United States. So there is a sense of trying to go out and learn in the West and come home. I also think, at least based on what I've read, right? I don't have a lot of their writings, that there is a Christian identity that might draw them to Hope, as opposed to, say, Michigan State or something like that. And there's also a real sense of shared immigrant experience I see in their writings. They don't say it explicitly, but there's a real sense that they're talking about home and missing their families and having their moms watch them go away. And I can just imagine, right, some other students at Hope thinking about the same things, right? And so I don't have anything definitive. I think there was a real Christian connection because they did identify as Christian. And I also think that there was a sense by the Japanese government that if they didn't send them, they at least allowed them to be there, because there was a real pullback at that time of Japanese students back to, and Japanese people in general back to Japan, that some of that was also sanctioned so they could go out and learn, because Japan was really in a transformational period of trying to figure out how to avoid being colonized or treated like China was, right? They were really trying to figure out how do we find a path forward. So nothing, again, quite definitive, but that's what I suspect based on what I've read. Yeah.
To follow up on that situation between the missionaries, the Japanese students who went back to Japan as missionaries, and he was accompanied by, what was the guy's name that went back?
Albertus Peters.
Yeah. We went to Japan for 2 years to teach at the Christian Academy of Japan. But at that time, Japanese who had spent time in the United States, when they went back to Japan, were not very well accepted by the Japanese people that had never left. And so they called them Nisei, or second generation. Anyway, the mission field there is still struggling. There's only like 1% of the whole population, and has become Christian. But there was a lot of Dutch people working in Japan. You can mention a bunch of Seitzmans, Wessenbergs, Runegies, the list goes on.
Yeah. And the Dutch have a special relationship with Japan as well, in that, you know, of the Western European powers, they were allowed into Japan earlier and longer than other places, right? And so I think that's another element of that story, that the Japanese and Dutch history is much longer and a little more complicated than, say, even the American and Japanese story, because there is at least some familiarity. Again, not a lot of conversions, not a lot of Christians living in Japan, but the Dutch and Japanese relationship is long. And again, what you're saying echoes exactly what Albertus writes back all the time, right? You know, that they really struggled there, and there was a real sense of hope in the 1870s that Japan was really just ready to turn on a dime. And by the time you get to the 1890s with Albertus, I think they're starting to really grapple with the fact that what they thought was a prime mission field is going to be a much, much heavier labor. Yeah. Yeah, we'll go here and then to Dr. Kugler.
So in your study, you know, a North City boy, Sam Nordoff, becomes a very famous surgeon in China. Did you find stuff out about him? Or?
I didn't encounter him. I don't know, you know, if he was from Orange City and goes after, he might have been a little bit later than when I was doing my research. But I didn't see that, but that's probably just a matter of the fact that I was working in an earlier time period.
He probably graduated from high school in the 40s sometime.
Yeah, and I didn't get much past in my actual deep dive research much past the 1910s. So I'm sure he's there. I just didn't encounter him. There's some really good records if you ever wanted to dig into that. They're digitized of the mission boards that you can get from the RCA, or Hope has some of those too. I'm sure we have them in Northwestern, or some of them somewhere. I say, looking at Doug expectantly, so maybe not. Don't hold me to it. No.
Andrew, like in an earlier period, the Scottish Presbyterians really liked Psalm 74:20. So you should remember the covenant for the dark places of the earth are filled with the habitations of cruelty.
Mm-hmm.
Did the Zweimer brothers did they talk about the dark places of the earth? Did they think of the American prairies as dark as the Middle East?
No, yeah,
You know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah, there's some really, I do this in some other parts of my work, where I'm looking at the ways they use language of dark places or places that need the Lord or even beyond reach, right? And some of the places where they see hope. But where aren't they right now? So if you asked them where the darkest places were, they would look to Africa, right? They really didn't see a lot of hope in Africa at the time. And I think I argue too that some of that is they didn't know much about Africa at the time either. They talk about Africa as if it's all the same. They know South Africa because there's Dutch people there. They know Egypt because Moses was there. And then everything else is the same to them. And so you do see some of that language, not as much about some of the places that I've talked about tonight, but it's often the places where they're kind of blind to them in that they don't have outposts there, they don't know much about them, they don't really see those cultures in complex ways. They have really interesting interpretations of racial theory at the time, like they're breaking up different races as they've got 4 different types of people and this is where they fit and that kind of thing. They talk a lot about that, and I haven't talked about that because it wasn't quite relevant here tonight, but they absolutely are thinking about that, and they see places like China, like Japan as promising mission fields in ways that they aren't quite convinced about other places in the world. Again, they aren't going to write anybody off because God could do anything, but they do see some places as more promising and potentially, more hopeful than others.
Do any of the people that you work on, are they keeping up with the atrocity literature that's coming out of the Congo? And I mean, the Baptist minister, former Civil War veteran, who was the first person to break the evidence of what was happening in the Belgian Congo. Are they talking about any of those kinds of things that are happening anywhere else in the world?
I don't see any of that in their writing. They're not talking. No, I've not seen any of that, and I don't know if it's an intentional unawareness of it. I don't know how much of it is different denomination. How much of it is an insular news community, right? If you're just reading De Volksvriend in Dutch, or you're just working in those communities, maybe you're not reading that. I don't know. I don't see anything about it, but that doesn't mean they weren't reading it or aware of it. They talk a lot about South Africa during the Boer War. That's different, of course, but there is some sense there. But yeah, no, I haven't seen anything about those in what I'm reading, but it doesn't mean they didn't see it or it isn't there and I haven't found it. As a good historian would say, like, it might be in there, I just haven't read it yet. So, yeah.
Did you learn to read Dutch so you could read the Volksvriend and some of this?
Yeah, yep. Yeah, my Dutch is not great, but it's good enough to get by, yes. Yeah. So I did a lot of the research, and that's one of the things I found too in some of my other research is you find that some of these Dutch communities talk differently and speak differently about things when they write in Dutch versus when they write in English. This is not related to what I talked about tonight, right? But there's this great example in the 1880s when there's an election here in Sioux County, right? In the Sioux County Herald, they're like, here's the ticket, like vote for who you want. This is the way it goes, But in the Volksvriend, they say we as Dutch people must vote as one, like rally behind the ticket, right? So in Dutch, they are not neutral. We are voting as one. The colony must stand. And in the Sioux County Herald, they're like, okay, here's the ticket. Do what you want to do. So yeah, but you wouldn't see that if you couldn't read at least a little bit of the Dutch. Again, I'm not an expert, but I can get by. So I have one more question, and then we're at time, right? I look to Sarah. Yeah, we're good. Okay.
I was interested in the pageant.
Yeah, I love the pageant.
Put on at Alton.
In Alton, yeah,
Was
but
there no place here to put it on?
I know, right? I imagine it was like all classis meetings. They were probably just rotating, as the classises want to do. But yeah, I don't know why they were there. Yeah.
Alton had an opera house, and I would presume that's where it was.
Yeah.
It was upstairs.
Yeah, I'm not sure. It didn't say where in Alton. They had met in Alton, and they put on the pageant. So yeah.
And Alton was a German
Yeah. Maybe they were trying to do their own form of missions, over in Alton. I don't know. Yeah. Any other questions? I know we're about at our time, but yeah.
As a young boy, when missionaries came to our church to give a kind of an update on what their work is, I was fascinated by the cultures of these other countries, Ceylon and places like that. But now, when the Dutch American missionaries went to these places, did they try to change those people's culture in any way?
Yeah, a little bit. There's really interesting, China, for example, they're really, really concerned about foot binding among Chinese women, right? And they really try to dissuade anybody who converts to Christianity from doing that with their daughters. They're very concerned about that. But even things like, there's some really interesting language, not among these, but other missionaries, where they don't like Chinese as a language. They just think characters are too hard. So they try to make Chinese into a script, and it's just not working. It doesn't work. There's a great book about it. But they do try to change some things, and one of the things you see, Frances is a good example of this, is when she arrives in the 1890s, she's really concerned about Chinese medicine and isn't sure how she feels about the Chinese people, and then as she leaves, she talks about how she has such great respect for them. And so a lot of times, these missionaries come thinking we need to change certain things, or we want to do things that can help, live a better life, or whatever the case. But by the time they've been there for a while, their tune really changes, and it is still doing mission work, but they've learned to accept and exist within a society. They're never okay with things like foot binding, but they aren't going to be as upset about the language or something like that. So you really see a lot of missionaries soften as they learn culture too. Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you, Andrew. We're so happy to have you here tonight and kind of coming back home.
Yeah,
we appreciate that. So I think everybody should give Andrew another round of applause. I want to make just a few announcements before I let you go. As a reminder, next month's Night at the Museum presentation will be held on Tuesday evening, September 17th at 6:30 p.m. Del Wallinga will present the antiquity of policing. And we're wondering what types of dark secrets may lurk in the cities of Orange City in the streets. So stay tuned for that. As another reminder, we continue to have museum articles for sale. Merchandise, including t-shirts. I believe Sarah has a t-shirt on tonight that you may purchase. In fact, I'd like you to. But anyway, all these pieces of merchandise go toward improving our museum, and also possibly we'll have a part-time employee for the museum where we can have the hours more open than we presently do. As another free bonus, the museum was gifted with a number of back copies of Annals of Iowa. And you're welcome to take a copy home and read through and see some of the stories that we have, and also relate to how that applies to our state and our city as well. You may pick them up by the front desk on your way out. I'd like to recognize Ruth Roger and Daryl Van Klumpberg at this time, if they would stand up, please. Ruth and Daryl have been doing a tremendous work in our community lately, improving the cemetery as far as the headstones, and a lot of the work as far as mapping out who's there and some of the history that we have there. So I'd like you to give them a round of applause at this time. I think Ruth and Daryl will be around afterwards for a little while if you'd like to talk to them and offer some of your services for volunteering for some of the work that they're doing. So see them and talk to them about that. The only other thing I have to say is thanks for coming, and we look forward to seeing you next month.